I don't know that there's a better book and conversation to kick off our summer author series with than this one. Because we've said, in particular, Sarah, you've said for a while now that there's a benefit to applying a psychological, human based lens to all of the social justice learning that we've been sharing on this show for the last 5 years. This conversation shows us why we are spending our summer talking about that very bridge, which over the course of the next few months will center discussions around well being, about the power of the pause, practical optimism, meditation, and so much more.
I'm glad you say that, Misasha, because I would think anybody listening would want to feel better, right? Especially in the midst of such a turbulent, divided time like 2024 is. Don't you want to feel better? So we're going to bring this conversation to you with social psychologist Dolly Chugh. We'll get into some beautiful stories that let us all remember that there are times that we prioritize comfort over discomfort. Sure, we'll do that. But that not knowing facts actually creates its own sense of discomfort too. So why not join us in the learning and the unlearning about our truths and our country's truths? Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your multi-ethnic, Japanese, and white hosts, Sarah and Misasha.
All right. I am so excited. I get excited about books a lot, but I, in particular, am excited to talk about this book with you, Dolly. So would you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Sure. My name is Dolly Chugh. I'm a professor at New York University. I'm a social psychologist, and I'm an author of the book that I think you're excited about is A More Just Future, Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change. It's basically it's a love letter to all the folks trying to help us see the complicated history of our country and our emotional relationship with that history, and an attempt as a psychologist to give us some tools to dig into it rather than run away from it, which is what I found myself doing.
I love that you described it that way. It reminds me of the one time we were on a TV interview, Misasha. I know you thought the same thing when they said, "Dear white women, what is that about?" And I kind of said it's like a love letter to white women to invite them into the fight. And it's a nice way of saying the hard things, because we do, like, even though these may be love letter type messages and heart led and intellectual, these are hard things that we're asking people to do. And I wondered if you could start our conversation by helping explain this. You wrote at the beginning of your book, unlearning is not just intellectual work, it's emotional work. And I feel like that's like a thread that runs through the entirety of your work. Can you lay the groundwork of what you mean by this for everybody?
Sure. Yeah, it's the hardest work, the emotional stuff. I mean, the stuff that digs literally into our souls is the hardest stuff of all, the stuff that threatens how we see ourselves and the identities we care about, groups we're part of. So the groundwork, I mean, I'll start with a story if it's okay. The groundwork begins when I was a mother of two young children, and I was pretty much flubbing most of the traditional, mom things like the cooking and all that stuff, and wasn't particularly patient. And, I was just like, not hitting it out of the park on those fronts. But what I was hitting it out of the park on was reading to them every night, also a book person, Misasha, like you. And every night until they were about 10 and 11, they're a year apart, I was reading to them every night. So we had elevated ourselves to like chapter books and long books and series, and including at one point in there, I read to them the entire Little House on the Prairie series. And it took a whole year to get through the whole series, reading a few pages every night. And I was like, on the mountain of parental smugness. I was just like, I am just killing it with this nightly reading thing. And the kids were that Little House on the Prairie is a series about the Ingalls family in the 1800s. And they were part of a number of people colonizing the country, particularly in their case, what we now call like Minnesota and South Dakota. And, it's a story of this hardworking family and their love and their loyalty and their faith and their tenacity and their perseverance. It was like all the values my husband and I are trying to pass on to our children. And they were all in. They went to bed every night dreaming about the Ingalls kids. And one of them drew, like, had to do a family drawing at school. And she came home, and I have two children. And in this drawing, there were three children. And I was like, oh, curious who the third child is. And she was like, she looked at me like, duh. And she's like, Laura, mom, like Laura Ingalls, the main character who wrote those books, because I literally think they went to sleep thinking this was their family. So this all culminated with us deciding to make it a 1 week summer vacation that we would go. We live on the East Coast. We would go to South Dakota and Minnesota and drive around and see all the places the Ingalls family lived, and like buy the prairie dresses that they sell at the little country store in these small towns like DeSmet, South Dakota. And our kids ran around wearing prairie dresses all day, every day. It was like the most picturesque. I don't even know if Instagram was invented, but the most Instagrammable thing you can imagine at the time. And we were literally watching them run around in prairie dresses through tall prairie grasses, big blue sky above us, when it suddenly, like out of nowhere, just hit me as I looked at this beautiful land. I was asking myself the question, wait, this little house on this prairie, whose land was this before it was the Ingalls land? And of course, we know it was the land of millions of Native Americans that had built communities and families and cultures and economies and traditions and rituals and lives and generations on that land, and the land was taken from them. But in that moment, that knowledge was so distant from my head. For an entire year, I had not really gotten into that with my kids. And what I want to tell you is that in that moment, as suddenly, the intellectual piece of this kind of broke through the emotional, nostalgic piece, I want to tell you that I was like, hey, kids, you know what? Let's broaden the story. Let me tell you more about this. Let's go back in time a little bit. Like, I wish I had made the story truer and more interesting for my kids. But instead, what I did was tell my brain, no, we're not doing this. We're not doing this. I don't know how to deal with this shame and the guilt and all the emotions that are coming up for me right now, and the disbelief that somehow this is only occurring to me now, a year into this. And so I just like pushed it aside and did not deal with it at all. And I thought back to that moment so many times since then, and just wondered why it was so hard to just tell my kids the truth, and wondered, as a social psychologist, there's got to be ways in which one can deal with something. It isn't even affecting them directly. I should be able to talk about this with them. I should be able to talk to myself. I should be able to educate myself. I really didn't know much, honestly, to even tell them. It would have been a pretty short conversation with a lot of questions without answers. And so the groundwork for this book really starts with that story of me wondering why I didn't know how to talk to my kids, why I didn't know why emotionally this was so hard, when intellectually it's really not that hard. There's a lot of information out there now.
I love that story, not only because when I was little and read the Little House on the Prairie books, I too was like, I could be in this family, not considering that there was no Japanese part of this story. And, I didn't care. The Oregon Trail too. I was like, this is manifest destiny. But, I think along with the concept of unlearning, you mentioned like decolonizing is unlearning. And I think especially when we're thinking about 2024 and where we are now, this is such an important piece, but such a difficult piece, right, to understand. And I want to talk a little bit about, in your book, you really go into sort of how we as a country have learned about things like slavery, right? Because I think, and I ask this also Sarah's heard this like so many times, but as a granddaughter of a Civil War historian who was really interested in first person narratives, right? Like free Black narratives, women's narratives, like the stories that weren't told. I probably grew up with a slightly different lens around this. Yet in school, I was also taught that one of the causes of slavery was states' rights, or one of the causes of the Civil War, right, was states' rights. And we know that first, foremost, fundamentally, over everything, right? It was slavery. And, in your book, you mentioned that the Southern Poverty Law Center, right, in 2017 had this evaluation of highly used history textbooks. And what it said about slavery was just jaw-dropping. And I feel like now in 2024, we are having similar conversations. And depending on where you live in the country, you may be learning a very different perspective, right? And possibly very incorrect perspective on what our true history is. And I love that phrase that you use, educational malpractice, right? Which is, really not connecting the dots between the causes and effects of things like slavery, right? So what do we do about this, and what happens if we kind of continue this way? Because in your story, you talk about, sort of the intellectual, the story you were just telling us, the intellectual and the emotional. But if we're continuing on these divided paths or, hidden paths, like what does that mean for us?
Yeah, that's so fascinating about your family's history and engagement with history, and then how it conflicts with sometimes when institutionally we're learning. I always want to be clear, this is not a slam on teachers at all, who are working harder than ever and with the toughest of jobs and the fewest of resources and the most complicated of times. So not a slam on teachers at all. It's often more about our institutions and than our teachers. I think, what do we do about it? We're in this binary that either we are going to teach X or we're not going to teach X, right? And I think the reason we've landed in this binary is because in some ways we're all, not all, and everyone is ignorant to these issues, but many of us who are ignorant to these issues about the more brutal parts of our country's history or the more paradoxical parts of our country's history, I think we're all like me on the prairie. Like we just don't, it's not that we don't want to know. I mean, we don't want to know, but it's not that we want to know, we just don't know how to do it emotionally. And I think that sometimes leads us to say, well, then we just won't do it at all. So I'm obviously not a fan of some of the laws and the changes and how things are being taught right now. And I have some empathy for where it's coming from this feeling of like, but I don't know how else to do it. And if I can't do it, how in the world am I going to talk to the kids about it? And if all these confusing emotions are coming up for me, what confusing emotions are going to come up for my kids? So I have some empathy, even though I fully disagree with kind of the execution here on how we got here. That is why I do think like historians are doing their work and journalists are doing the work. This is where psychologists can do some work to help us figure out how to deal with these things. And that's kind of rather than do teach it or don't teach it, maybe it's a question of kind of how do we teach it or how do we talk about it? And as I've heard both of you talk about in another one of your episodes, kids are so into issues of justice. Anybody who's ever had more than one child is very aware that they are measuring everything. And so it's not actually that hard to explain to kids that something happened that wasn't fair and that it had repercussions. They get that if you explain to them that, one kid got more video game time than the other kid, and that happened repeatedly day after day, that the kid with the more video game time probably built up higher scores and collected more tokens and goblins and all the things that more playing time lends itself to, and therefore at the end of the month was better positioned on the video game than the kid who had less time and probably was also more skilled and had built up their knowledge of the game in a deeper way. So I think kids understand issues of fairness in the moment, and they understand how issues of fairness can play out over time. It's the rest of us I think I'm aligned with what I've heard the two of you speculate, that it's the rest of us that are having a harder time.
First, I've never heard a takedown of people not being allowed to play the game of capitalism and being invested in our country's history in quite that way. And so I love that for all the gamers who are listening too, because I've never heard it explained that way, but that totally makes sense. And I also think you've made a great case for why, Misasha and I've been talking more and more about the psychological lens as it applies to well-being, because I think all of us as a nation need to build up our personal ability to cope with all of these uncomfortable feelings and not say our life is meant to just maximize comfort. We have to build up resilience. And that by doing so, we also build up our country's tolerance to facing our past and facing our differences and injustices in a much more effective way.
I love that. And by the way, Sarah, the video game thing just came to me off the top of my head. That was complete improv. So I'm glad you named it so we can both and all remember it if it's useful for the future. One riff on what you just said about comfort. And while I certainly was feeling uncomfortable on the prairie, so I get that, like, I chose comfort over discomfort in that moment. But the thing that I think we're also missing the opportunity on is that there is discomfort in not being able to understand the world around you. So in almost every community in our country, if you walk out the door, you will either see homogeneity in terms of the ethnic and racial makeup of the community you're in, or you will see heterogeneity but segregated. There will be differences in where people live. There will be visible differences in their socioeconomic status that a 5-year-old could point out to you. There will be differences in what the schools look like. There will be differences in the number of, when you look at people who are homeless, you will see racial and ethnic differences. It is so obvious that a young child can see those differences. And our brains want to fill in blanks. Our brains want explanations for things. And so without the knowledge of how we got here, our brain will fill in the blanks with all sorts of other explanations as to why that social order exists. And I find that also very uncomfortable, kind of the way the brain fills in the blanks with the lack of historical knowledge. And I think a lot of people find that uncomfortable. And so in some ways, when you start giving people the information about how we got here and you allow them to connect the dots, there's actually comfort in that. Like, okay, so this is terrible, but also it makes exact sense. Like if we go with our video game analogy, like, yeah, well, of course, that's good. This is what you would end up with it's not because there's some genetic this, or there's some preordained that, or there's some cosmic karmic. It's none of those kind of wild explanations. This is what happens when one person gets more video game time.
It's such a good point, and I'm really glad you took the time to explain that and frame that. And it reminds me of something that I want to ask about, because one of the pushbacks that we hear a certain segment of the population say is, but let's make America great again, right? Like, let's go back to those days. There's a sense of nostalgia, like, oh, but it was, like Gone with the Wind, like that sort of. Some segment of our population has nostalgia for how this country used to be. What is the role that emotion plays in how we see ourselves and how we see our communities and our history?
Well, let's talk about the science of nostalgia. The science of nostalgia is really interesting. Nostalgia, which is kind of a sentimental form of history. So it's something from the past, but it's like in a kind of warm, fuzzy version of it. Nostalgia is so seductive. It is so addictive. It is, what researchers find is that it increases our sense of belonging. It increases our sense of security. When we're feeling lonely, we reach for nostalgia. It's economically very powerful. If you look at pretty much every major industry, there's some like subsector of that industry that's a nostalgia-driven industry, whether it's travel or entertainment or fashion or music or sports, or even within corporations, there's always the sort of narratives that have kind of intergenerationally carried that company forward, like from the founder to now. You look at like Nike as an example. So nostalgia is a universally human yearning, particularly when we're not feeling secure and stable. So psychologically, that's a powerful urge to overcome. And so when we talk about this particular form of nostalgia for a very particular form of the past that was applicable to a very particular population, we can psychologically see where that's coming from. But I do think what's happened is it's been politicized, right? So sometimes some of the folks that are sort of drawn to that nostalgia, maybe they actually themselves, if they were to go in the time machine and go back, their lives might not have been as ideal as sort of, they might pick today over then if they had the time machine steering wheel. And that's where I think the politicization of this may be kind of overshadowing even the actual yearning for a different time. The example I like to use about nostalgia is like, if I pull out, I have two daughters that are in their late teens, so they're launching into young adulthood right now. So when I pull out those little baby outfits that they wore when they were infants, I mean, like, I'm like swimming in nostalgia. I'm soaked in nostalgia. My tears, like the nostalgia. And if you actually ask me to tell you about those months and years of their lives and my life, it was beyond horrible. It was so hard. It was 3 years of not sleeping. It was an intense workload that my husband and I were both managing. It was crises in our extended families that we were dealing with at the same time. It was really, really hard. And there's no part of my being that wants to go back there. But that I really have to turn the dial in the time machine to see that, because my first reaction is the nostalgic reaction. So I think in terms of those who want to make America great again, for those for whom that's a political statement, I think that's speaking to something else. But for those for whom it's a genuine yearning and nostalgic thirst, I wonder if the actual history for them as sweet as they want it to be. And of course, what we know is that even if it was not necessarily sweet for others.
It's such a good point about adjusting that knob and making sure you're not just remembering this one little thing, but readjusting the aperture of your storytelling. And I want to ask then this sort of follow-up question, because I feel like you also talked in your book about the simple story, the little fable of Rosa Parks that we often teach younger kids, right? And I think what might be helpful, you also talk about the 3 red flags when it comes to figuring out what is a fable? What is false nostalgia, perhaps? Like if we can conflate those two things, how do we figure out if what we're talking about is in fact far too oversimplified and not capturing the big picture to get a full grasp of what history really is?
Yeah, I was amazed to learn that very well documented, indisputably true, that Rosa Parks had been an activist her whole life, that when she was a young child, her family actually moved to a different neighborhood because she was unwilling to step off the sidewalk to let white school kids pass, and therefore would get into fights as a result. And the Jim Crow laws and norms of her community required that she step off the sidewalk. When she graduated high school and started working, she was an active volunteer with NAACP. It was not at all a sort of plot twist that she ended up not giving up her seat on the bus. It was the most predictable thing ever that would happen. I mean, it was maybe the plot twist might have been that particular moment went viral when there have been so many other moments of civil disobedience that didn't. That it was a tipping point in the civil rights movement. And yet the story I grew up with was of the elderly, tired seamstress on her way home from work whose feet were hurting, so she didn't want to give up her seat. Well, let's begin with elderly. She was 42 at the time.
Ouch. That is not old,
Ouch.
folks. Let's just be clear.
Come on, folks.
That is not old. Okay. We're rewriting that script.
I know, right? Okay, so right there. And it was not accidental. And it was not, when the police arrived, her question to them is, why do you push us around? I mean, she was not at all unwilling to stand up and be, in the words of historian Jean Thea Harris, rebellious. But this flattened fable, which has, in response to your question, 3 characteristics: a clear cause and effect. So in the fable version of it, Rosa Parks did something and then laws were changed. Like it feels like one thing happened and then another thing happened. Secondly, the good guys always win in the racial fable. So in this particular story, it ignores the fact that there have been many other attempts just like this, where there was no change that resulted from it. So it by sort of narrowing the aperture, to use your example, to just one incident where there was some impact of the action, it looks like the good guys always win. It looks like everyone just sort of, kind of high-fived. It was like, oh gosh, you're right, oversight, let's fix it. And there was like high fives and everyone agreed. And then the third one, which I'm looking up because I'm blanking out. Oh yeah, Flawless Heroes. We can put the book back under the computer to boost it up. It's good to write books so you can use them to boost your laptops. The Flawless Heroes, the idea that flawless individual heroes, that it's an individual who's, as we said, kind of this elderly, docile character, which sort of in that narrative is somehow more deserving of our support than someone who's challenging the status quo, so flawless in that kind of way, and operating alone when in fact she was part of the NAACP and there was a whole legal team there to support her. So these three red flags of clear cause and effect, good guys always win, and flawless individual heroes, when we see those in stories or narratives about how change happens, whether it has to do with racial equity or any change, it could be like in your community, there's been a change, or in the way your organization at work talks about some change that took place. Anytime it has those elements to it, chances are it's a fableized version of what really happened, because what we know from studies of human behavior and of organizational change is that's almost never how change happens. It's almost always like many failed attempts and lots of iterations, and 1.0 and 2.0 and 3.0, and learning as you go, and lots of people involved, and unsung heroes, and usually someone having to kind of pound the table in a way that doesn't always lend itself to like popular, like support. Like the most liked person is not always the change agent. It's sometimes the person willing to be disliked, or willing to go against the norm, or willing to be the one on the elevator who like doesn't look forward when everyone else is looking forward, and doesn't care that you think that's odd. Like change makers are usually more like that and less like people pleasers. I'm pointing at myself because I consider myself to be a little more people pleaser sometimes. And so the danger of us not recognizing those three red flags, and therefore missing that what we're hearing is a fable, it's a little bit like nostalgia. The danger of confusing history with nostalgia, the danger of confusing what really happened with the fableized version of what happened, is that when someone's trying to make change now in the present, we are not going to necessarily support it, because we're going to say things like, oh, that's not how people aren't going to listen to you if you do it that way, or you've got to watch your tone, or if only they would go about this the right way and not be so disruptive. Because we think Rosa Parks was not disruptive. We think that the way we got to whatever progress we made to date happened in a way that was clear cause and effect, flawless individual heroes, and with the good guys always winning.
I think that is so important, because it kind of leads me to what I'd like to ask next, which is about hindsight bias, because I think it's so interesting, because it is so, I don't know, safe in some ways, right? When you think about, of course, because we're here, right? This is the one path that got us from A to B. Whereas like there could be 25 paths, and a lot of those could have been equally valid at different times in different ways, or contain a lot of those elements that you were talking about, right? It's not just a sanitized linear path, right? History isn't linear to begin with, but it's the easiest way sometimes for us to make sense of things. And also to your point about not changing or not challenging the way that things have happened, because of course, if you do A, you get to B. If you do any other option, also removing all of the disagreement and divisiveness, right, along the way, then that's the only way you can get to B. So can you talk a little bit about why this is, a tool that we use and how we can think about this?
Yeah, the hindsight bias, it's like, that's one that I find it so hard to think in counterfactuals. And counterfactual is like the what if, like what you were just explaining, kind of the what if X had happened instead of Y. And there's a movie, gosh, I think it was like in the 90s. It's pretty old now, but it's called Sliding Doors. It was like this idea of like the subway doors are closing, and the main character either just just makes it like kind of jumps through the doors and makes it on the subway, or just misses the subway. And like, then the movie takes us through these like two versions of her life. And we see, this one little micro moment changes her whole trajectory. And the hindsight bias is like, it's hard. And I guess the more contemporary example is like Everything Everywhere All at Once, the movie that won the Oscar recently, which was a pretty confusing movie, but I think it was about, I don't know, one of your listeners can let me know if I've misunderstood the whole premise of the movie, but I think it was basically a big like hindsight bias, counterfactual exploration movie of like, what if all these different things had happened? But as you said, what happens is, because it's our brains, like what actually has happened is so sticky, like we can't assume any other current state. We take for granted whatever it took, whatever the divisiveness, as you said, it took to get to today, and assume, well, of course, we don't have slavery. Of course, we don't have Jim Crow laws anymore. Of course, women can have credit cards in their name. Like we just take it to be. And the reality is all of those things happened as the direct result of very specific events and very specific actions. And just like in Everything Everywhere All at Once, if like a few things had gone differently, if you made it through the door or not made it through the door of the subway, maybe we're not getting our own credit cards. Like that could have happened.
Yeah, I think it speaks to sort of getting curious about why is it, Misasha's favorite question, why is it that we do have credit cards? Why is it, because that was only in the 70s, right? That women were allowed to get credit cards. Like,
whoa.
I think,
like I was in elementary school by then. Of course, I wasn't thinking about credit cards, but
right.
Yeah.
But like it's, Misasha and I talk about the fact that our parents would not have been legally allowed to get married had they gotten married a decade earlier. Like these are all things people push for. And we do have to get curious about it, as opposed to taking, it's a good practice going back to like merging social skills and human skills with history. It's like not taking things for granted is probably a healthy thing for all of us to do, and appreciate that we have what we have, and not think that that's just a given in any given. People have to work for what we have. But then I think I have a question about the flip side of, yes, you appreciate things, that everything's going well, but then we also mess stuff up, And so I wanted to talk before we close out about the power of apology. Like, why are apologies so important for humans, for every one of us? And then sort of changing the aperture again, why is it so odd, perhaps, in history that the US has never apologized for slavery, especially when you consider what Japan did, what, Germany, like there's other countries have done this. What does it mean that the US has not apologized?
Yeah. It's really fascinating that we haven't. Like, just if we, for a moment, we go to the intellectual part of this, like, it's really fascinating that we haven't, because it's not, I don't think too many people are standing on the hill or the mountain. It would have to be a very tall mountain, claiming that they defending slavery. Like, not too many people are actually saying that. So why is it so hard to just apologize for it? But there is something, I think, that ties to this idea that we haven't really reckoned with it. Like I've been there, like I've done something that I know was like, I've been like snippy with someone, and I know it was like not their fault, and I kind of took it out on them, and I know I should apologize, but like I still haven't quite reckoned with why I was in that mood that I was in, why I was being all like, trying to avoid saying bad words, like, just I'm trying to avoid why I just can't quite like get myself to the point of acknowledging that I just messed up, and I should just say I'm sorry, and everything would be better if I would say it, but I just can't get myself to do it for some reason. And it seems like on a national level there is something like that going on there. I do think there's kind of a no-win around it also, that like on the one hand, it's like a minimum thing, like just apologize. It's clearly wrong. Like, why not apologize? But on the other hand, it's like, well, yeah, but that's just symbolic. We do know that symbols are meaningful. So just symbolic doesn't mean symbols aren't meaningful. What about all the actual harm that's been done that continues like intergenerationally? And so that gets to the question of reparations. And so I don't know if it's like we don't want to deal with the question of reparations, so therefore we don't deal with the apology. So I'm not sure I have like a lot of clarity myself on what's going on there. I do think that on a more micro scale, like this question of ownership and accountability and apology, that I really like the metaphor of Isabel Wilkerson, where in her book Caste, she talks about old houses. And like if you buy an old house, even if it does well in the inspection and everything, that you're going to get in there and like find something behind the walls or in the basement. And the question when that happens is not going to be, well, I guess, I didn't cause what happened in that basement, so therefore I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm just going to let the pipes freeze. And, oh, well, that's not my problem because they weren't originally my pipes. Obviously, you deal with it because it's your house now, and you can gripe about it and, pound the table and curse up a storm, but still in the end, you got to deal with the pipes. And I think on a micro level where each of us today can honestly say, it wasn't my fault, I didn't do all those things. That is true, but what Isabel Wilkerson argues is that it's still our house. We own the house now. So there is still some responsibility that we bear for it. And so I think the apology might also be tied to kind of like, are we taking ownership of the house or not?
I love that analogy. And I think it's an analogy that, at least every homeowner or someone who's lived in an old house can really understand, right? There is, even if you didn't cause the issue, right, it is still your responsibility to fix it, or you live in a crumbling old house that just gets worse, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I appreciate you sharing that because I think it's such a good one. We could talk to you forever, basically. But, is there something that we haven't asked that you really want to share from the book, or anything that's come up in conversation that you would love to share with our listeners?
Yeah. First of all, I just love that y'all are doing this. I think you've built such a community and platform, and I really appreciate kind of the spirit and the integrity with how you're doing it. Like, I hear you doing the work that you're asking others to do. And there's a lot of integrity in that. I guess what I would end with is just this idea of unlearning, which is kind of a theme of A More Just Future. Unlearning is harder than learning. So we will resist it because we have to kind of let go of something in order to pick up something. With learning, you just pick it up. With unlearning, you have to let it go and then pick it up. And so we're sort of in that, do I let it go moment? That said, there is so much joy in being a lifelong learner. There's a lot of joy in being a lifelong unlearner as well. There's this sense of discovery that comes with it. And I think the more I've been kind of talking to groups of people about this idea of being a lifelong unlearner, the more excited I personally have gotten about it, and sort of all the ways it can apply to my life, not just our country's past, but like everything kind of, in the age of AI, what do we need to unlearn about what is knowledge and what is skill and what is work? And, where we're unlearning constantly or needing to. So I guess the thing I would just leave us with is what does it look like to be a lifelong unlearner?
I love that. Thank you so much. Now, I know you have your Dear Good People newsletter. Where else can people find you if they want to hear and learn more from you and unlearn with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that we have similar naming strategies. I noticed that. That was so cool. Yeah, Dear Good People is a fun monthly kind of zeitgeisty, whatever is kind of on my mind, usually something I'm grappling with myself that ties to being what I call a more goodish person or a more growthy person or unlearning. And if you go to dollychugh.com, DOLLYCHUGH.com, you can sign up for the newsletter. You can see all the past newsletters without signing up. They're just there to go down the rabbit hole on. A More Just Future is also there as well if you're interested in taking a look at the book. Dr. Phil thinks everyone should read it. So,
I mean, obviously, then, yeah.
I mean,
So do we. Sasha and Sarah say everyone should read it too. So that holds the same weight, obviously,
oh, that means even more to me, to be totally honest.
Well, thank you again for sharing this time with us. We really, really appreciate it and love the lens that you're bringing to this really important work.
Thank you. The respect is mutual. I appreciate it.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. Yes, we're on social media. And yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book. But the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.